A long time ago, in the age of swords and sorcery, there existed a vile, evil lich. One that wished for nothing but to spread fear and misery across the lands. This lich used every measure they could to achieve their fiendish deeds, from creating plagues, to constructing horrible monstrosities, and even raising the dead. One such monster raised by the lich was a wraith, manifested from a lonely being that had passed away under mysterious circumstances. The Wraith was tasked with assaulting any trespassers that dared approach their domain, a task he performed amicably at, and even delighted in. Indeed, many would-be soldiers succumbed to his frightful measures, and the few with the steeled nerves to overcome his tactics would eventually fall to the horrors that awaited them inside the lair. This would proceed apace for many years. Over time, however, changes began to take place within the Wraith. Unbeknownst to even himself, he was gradually gaining an understanding of the world around him. He learned about the people that he encountered, the creatures that inhabited the region, and was even taking more notice of the way the seasons changed. Memories also slowly trickled in of a life that he had lived once before. Happy memories of times spent with friends and loved ones, of new experiences and fortunate meetings. The unfortunate ghost came to understand that the tasks he performed and took great delight in were meant to cause despair, that this was an unlife that was forced onto him by a being that thought only of performing the most diabolical of acts. Indeed, the Wraith was beginning to gain something that normally only belonged to mortals: humanity. The Wraith came to a decision after some deep thought. He wanted to find a way out of the Lich's servitude, but he could not just simply attack the fiend directly, for they were much more powerful than he could ever become. No, he needed to devise a plan. Discretion would be necessary, though, as any hint of rebellion would likely result in an excruciating punishment. As a side effect of being brought into undeath, he had lost the use of the spoken word, only being able to use ghastly wails as a means to communicate. As such, the Wraith made regaining familiarity of the mortal tongue the first step. It was a long and agonizing process, and the Wraith had difficulties retaining much of the knowledge he gained. It was when a rather arrogant paladin decided to encroach upon the lair when it finally happened. Becoming frustrated with the paladin's attempts to brush him aside, the Wraith finally expelled a singular word in such a distorted and ungodly tone that it struck fear in almost every living thing within range. But it was, in fact, a word. Upon realizing what he had accomplished, and while the paladin now ran for the hills with tears in his eyes and a foul smell emanating from his armor, the Wraith knew that his freedom could be attained. The next step was to memorize all the traps that littered the Lich's lair. There were many winding pathways and even more pratfalls. However, he was able to utilize the ample amount of zombies that wandered the denizen, using them as bait to help trigger some of the more dangerous elements and making them look like accidents. It took weeks of mental mapping, but after many bouts of trial and error, he had the inner workings fully memorized down to the most minute detail. The third step was to acquire co-conspirators. Most of the other monsters that were part of the army were completely loyal to the Lich, and would certainly rat him out if he approached them with his query. It seemed for a while that this part of the plan would end up being a singular effort. Eventually, the Wraith would find a most unlikely ally. One of the many creatures the Lich had constructed was an abomination. A massive monster whose form defied description. This monster was locked inside of a cramped cage all hours of the day, being poked and prodded with tools of torture. When ready, the massive monstrosity would be unleashed onto an unsuspecting village, and its built-up rage would cause it to destroy everything in sight before the kingdom's militia could respond. The Wraith decided to attempt to gain the trust of this poor creature. While the Lich was preoccupied with other matters, the Wraith would sneak into the monster's holding area, attempting to communicate with it and providing food. The process was slow, however. After another month of trying, the abomination finally began to warm up to the Wraith. They established a method of communication, and after some time, the two truly began to form a bond. At last, all the details of the plan were coming together. There was only one more factor that was necessary in order for everything to work, but it was a problematic one. For at this point, there were few adventurers that were able to proceed into the Lich's lair safely, and the Lich's own increasing paranoia was making it more difficult to plan things behind their back. There needed to be something that would put the Lich in a situation where they couldn't see the betrayal coming. However, fate tends to intervene at interesting times. One winter evening, an adventuring party found their way to the Lich's lair, intent on ending the villain's reign of terror once and for all. The Wraith, upon spotting the group from his perch, immediately recognized their combined strength. He realized that this was as good of an opportunity as he was going to have to put his plan into full effect. The heroes found their way through the lair with ease, navigating past the poison spike trap, decoding the bleeding eye puzzle, and banishing the various monster hordes that attempted to stymie their progress. The Wraith, meanwhile, having full knowledge of the dangers of the lair, was able to use his spectral powers to subtly point out any threats that would otherwise be missed by the group, aiding their progression while avoiding the Lich's attention as much as possible. At last, the heroes made their way to the Lich's inner sanctum. They steeled their resolve for the final encounter, while the Lich sought to put an end to their journey. The fighting that ensued was fierce. The Lich knew many corrosive magics, but the heroes were able to counter every one of them. But then, the Lich fell back on a spell that debilitated the party. Wounded heavily, the vile fiend made a desperate attempt to flee. This was where the final part of the Wraith's plan was put into motion. The Wraith knew that the Lich's escape path passed by the room where the abomination was being held at, and while they were distracted with combat, he was able to open the large but surprisingly mundane locks that held its cage shut. Once the Lich entered the room, the surprise was sprung. They found themselves looking directly at a 10-foot-tall monstrosity of their own creation, and it desired revenge against the being that tormented it for so long. The Lich, weakened from the dramatic battle they fled from, was no match for the beast, and was thus beaten down swiftly. They sought to retreat once again, their life hanging by a thread. However, by this time, the spell that had held the heroes in place wore off, and the group had started to give chase. The delay caused by the abomination allowed them to catch up to their adversary with ease. At that moment, the deciding blow was struck, and the Lich was finally no more. The Wraith rejoiced at the defeat of his master, for all the time spent planning how to attain his freedom had finally paid off. At last, he revealed himself to the heroes, explaining the situation and thanking the brave group for their deeds. The heroes, understanding the circumstances of his servitude and agreeing that their ghostly ally played a large role in their success, spared him any punishment for being forced to follow such a vile master. For its part, the abomination was allowed to leave to someplace far away from civilization to live in peace. The heroes, meanwhile, returned to their kingdom to cheers, adorations, and happily ever afters. The Wraith, meanwhile, was now at a crossroads. What would he do now? He had no interest in returning to the underworld, and he also had no longer had a purpose in unlife. He then thought back to the bravery of the heroes who put their lives at risk for a noble deed. Although the Lich no longer commanded the ghostly figure, he he was still a being of fury and rage. Thus, he sought a way to utilize his spectral powers to do good in the world and to better himself as an undead entity. This was a journey that would continue all the way to the modern era. He had taken up residence in an abandoned cemetery, calling a large, dilapidated mausoleum as his home. Although he did still enjoy scaring people, his actions were now driven by his own purpose, a need to protect the hallowed ground and the spirits that resided within it from troublesome individuals. He opted for more light-hearted scares towards those that just happened to wander nearby, and more targeted, fearful frights towards those who would dare disrespect the ground that they walked on. More importantly, he was still making an effort to be a better Wraith than he was in the past. In this respect, the journey was far from over.